Hi everyone. Today we're going to try to identify and put a date on this wonderful piece of antique carnival glass that I've picked up recently in a local antique shop. When I look for interesting pieces, beautiful pieces, I either go to estate sales, antique stores, thrift stores, sometimes garage sales. You just don't know where you're going to find a stunning piece of history in the process as well. Now, this bowl was interesting. I picked it up, like I said, in a local antique shop, and the tag really didn't have much information on it. It just said, stunning piece of early carnival glass. When I used Google Lens AI to try to help me identify this piece, while it's a wonderful tool, it had trouble with it. One of the things, a characteristic about this bowl that was causing the AI to have issues is the inclusion of a singular leaf here in the bottom of the piece of carnival glass. Typically, when you find a singular leaf or a singular design, a motif from the design, let's say, that is a characteristic of Fenton glass. Fenton was a huge manufacturer in the early American pressed glass period, as well as Imperial glass. Now, Imperial glass, it turns out this is a piece of antique Imperial glass. It is a wonderful example of their early carnival glass. Let's get into how we identified this bowl. So the AI was having issues. We were left with a couple of options. I personally ruled out Fenton. Just there's certain things about the density of the glass, the feel of it, the texture of it, the sheen, just certain qualities. I personally did not believe that this was a Fenton piece. But the piece is unsigned, so I knew it was older, and we just did some digging. So, taking my unsigned piece, I went to the Early American Pressed Glass Society's website and was able to find, let me move this over so you can see. I was able to find, just a second, this pattern on their website, which is, as you'll notice, the same pattern from our bowl. This pattern was referred to by Imperial as Imperial Grape. They did reissue some carnival glass in the 60s and 70s, and they might have done Imperial Grape at the time, but their main style from that time period, their contemporary carnival glass, was called Heavy Grape. But their classic carnival glass pieces, this was known as Imperial Grape. You can see some neat characteristics about the design. Not only does it have a scalloped clear rim, but there is a double scallop design underneath it that follows around the edge of the bowl. It's particularly attractive. You'll also notice that there is a textured, somewhat stippled background to the piece itself. The design has this textured background. The leaves lay on top, and while they do have the veins and the detailing in them, the glass on the leaves itself is smooth and clear. It is not stippled or textured, as well as the grapes are clear and smooth. No texturing on the grapes, the raised grapes. So the raised leaves and grapes are clear and smooth, while the texture in the background is kind of this dimpled, ripply feel. So you see that here in this piece on the Early American Pressed Glass Society site. Let's talk about this a little bit. I'll just read from the webpage. Imperial Glass Company of Bel Air, Ohio. The company operated from 1904 to 1984. This design, Imperial Grape vintage piece, was introduced circa 1912. Excuse me. Now, what's interesting is they do note that this piece, this design, appeared in a 1912 catalog, but note that it could be a year or two earlier. They note that clear crystal is the glass that is sprayed to make carnival glass, so this design could date as early as 1910. They know that this pattern was also produced with an iridized carnival glass finish. Now, in order to learn more, now that we've got an approximate time period and have started to match the design, we're going to go over to Carnival Glass Worldwide. And they've got a wonderful website that talks about all kinds of Carnival glass, but they do have a section on Imperial Glass from Bel Air, Ohio. And one of the things that it's important, I'm going to set the bowl down, it's important to note this section right down here. They are talking about an ad from Imperial selling iridescent red glass as early as July 1908. So while they call this a one-off item, it does provide evidence that Carnival Glass was firmly in line at an Imperial company as early as 1908. So knowing that that's the approximate time period, we were able to also dig further into the Imperial Glass Antique Glass advertising archives, and we find this. This is an ad from March 16th, 1911 that talks about their red iridescent glass. And what we want to note here is we definitely see the style of this bowl start to show up in these ads. We do have the Imperial Grape pattern, but notice here we have a scalloped edge, and I don't think I can get close enough, but if we really look, we can see that there's a double scallop that follows that border. So we start to see this design, this pattern show up as early as March 16th, 1911. So we know the overall pattern was produced in 1910. We know that this was starting to be advertised in 1911. Now, it's interesting to note that Imperial didn't make what we think of as red Carnival glass. They just did not. And I'm going to show you first, and then I'm going to read a little bit more so you understand. What they did was include a red tint in their glass and basically their Marigold. And I don't know that I can get far enough away from this now that it actually shows. But when you get this Carnival glass in there we go. In certain angles and certain light, you can see that there is a definite red, ruby kind of a tint, see it, start to show up in the bowl. They refer to this red ruby tint as Rubigold. Rubigold. But it was also the term that they used, and it really denoted their marigold color. So what we have here is the early example of their Rubigold / Marigold. And it's just a fascinating example of their early piece of Carnival glass. Now let's read back on the site. Note about, and I'm going to read from right down here. Note about the comment red iridescent in the March 16th ad above. Imperial actually made very little classic Carnival in red, but it is a color they used when they reintroduced Contemporary Carnival from the 1960s on. The use of red here is consistent with the way Imperial advertised their Rubigold / Marigold. And lo and behold, all of the product color codes in the ad are M, meaning Rubigold Marigold, definitely not red. So now we have an approximate beginning date of our glass. We've got the color, we've got the company. The thing here that's important to note, the other identifying factor is, and I mentioned this earlier, there is no marking on this bowl. There is no marking whatsoever. And Imperial Glass was known for having, in their later Carnival Glass, an IG. Go back to this page. They would have something similar to this, an I and a G together for Imperial Glass. In the 1970s, Imperial was struggling, and the Lenox company, the Lenox glass, everybody's heard of Lenox China. Lenox actually bought out Imperial in 1973, and the marking would have become LIG for Lenox Imperial Glass. Later on in the 80s, the business sold once again to a man named Arthur Lorch, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his name. But the Lenox Imperial Glass Company became the Arthur Lorch Imperial Glass Company. So you see the A mixed in with the L, followed by the IG. This is all to do with their Contemporary Carnival Glass, produced from 1962 through the 1970s. The company actually went out of business entirely by 1984 approximately. But this piece is unmarked, and that is the last key to the puzzle that lets us know that this is a classic piece of Imperial Carnival Glass and not a contemporary piece of Carnival Glass. You also know it's pressed glass by the seams in the piece. If you notice, there are a few seams around the bowl. There is some light chip, little nick in the edge of the bowl. There's some scratching from use over the years. But the bowl is actually in great shape. It does show some use. It doesn't show a ton of wear on the collared bottom. So it would lead me to believe it was used infrequently. But also at the same time, I can see around the edge, this is part of the design. That is not a chip or anything. This is where the seam comes up. And it's just how that dimple is reflected in the light. That is not a chip. That's a natural property of the bowl. But you can see on the edge, there is some light scratching and just general kind of wear marks in this gold. You can kind of... Now, some of that is from the production process that you would have used on the bowl back in the day. But there is some light scratching and wear from use. There we go. We can see it a little bit better right there. But overall, the bowl is, there aren't any big chips missing. There are no cracks. It's a wonderful piece. And, knowing that it dates from anywhere really from 1911 to possibly, let's say, the late 20s, this bowl is over 100 years old. So we've solved the mystery. We have a great piece of Imperial Glass, Imperial Grape, from the early 1900s. And this is just a beautiful example of work from that time period. So there we have it. Now we have learned how to identify and approximately time date our antique glass piece. And I do want to thank the people at the Early American Pressed Glass Society and the folks over at Carnival Glass Worldwide. Their help has been invaluable with getting this mystery solved.